Hello again, 122. In part 3, we will go over the last question from chapter 21, dealing with why the European imperialist nations in more detail wanted to carve up Africa, and I'll also take some time to explain some of the takeovers that happened in Southeast Asia as well. In 1819, the colonial administrator Stamford Raffles found a new British colony on the island of Singapore at the tip of the peninsula. Singapore became a major stopping point for traffic en route to and from China, as we'll see in a map in a little bit, and to other commercial centers in Southeast Asia. Very, very important port to this day. The British got into Burma in 1826, and now the French are concerned that the British might acquire a monopoly of trade in South China. So the French then attacked Vietnam. And although they didn't completely take it over at this time, the Nguyen dynasty in Vietnam was ultimately forced to cede some of the territories, and a generation later they will take over the rest of the country to the north. French rule was extended, and because now they want to protect Vietnam, they expanded into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, and that led to the creation of the French-ruled Indo-Chinese Union. Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam formerly was known as Indochina during the colonial period. In the Philippines, Commodore Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet during the War of 1898, and President McKinley is not really sure what to do with these vast islands, but ultimately they decided that the moral thing to do was to turn the islands into an American colony to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Japanese. In fact, the Americans, like the Spanish before them, found the islands a convenient jumping off point for the China trade. But not everybody supported this colonization, because the forces under Emilio Aguinaldo had just fought the Spanish. Now they don't want to be colonized by the Americans, and they fight against the Americans for a few years intensely, trying to establish their independence from both Spain and the United States. But America's first war against guerrilla forces in Asia was a success, and the bulk of the resistance collapsed in 1901. There's going to be sporadic fighting after this for quite a few more years. And now McKinley has his stepping stone to the rich markets of China. And here you have a map about Southeast Asia, what it looks like by about 1900. You have the British controlling Burma, and Thailand will remain independent. It is a buffer between the French and the British colonial forces in this part of mainland Southeast Asia. The Brits are also in Malay and Singapore, whereas the Dutch agreed to this as long as they were allowed to keep their colonies in other parts of Indonesia. The Spanish and Americans, after 1898, control the Philippines, and the Portuguese, who were the original Europeans out here from the 1500s on, are now reduced to a presence on Timor only. And again, Thailand is the buffer, and they play the British and the French off against one another, and they maintain their independence by doing so. And the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Commerce, is a very important waterway because it is the quickest way to get around and get up to China and the lucrative China market that the Europeans are all interested in. More on that in chapter 22. This is what Singapore looked like. It was a rich mixture of peoples, multiracial. They come there to work as merchants or laborers or craftsmen. And this was an extremely busy harbor by the beginning of the 1800s. And one of the big natural resources of Southeast Asia that the Europeans are interested in the Industrial Revolution was rubber. And rubber trees grow very, very well there. And also in Brazil as well, where they were transported from to Southeast Asia. And the latex comes out of the tree, and eventually it's pressed into sheets, and then it is shipped back to Europe for further refining. In the tires, in the burgeoning automobile market that is now growing later on in the early 20th century, and then those rubber supplies are going to be cut off, and eventually synthetic rubber will be developed during World War II, reducing the need for this natural latex. And this is a good chronology if you want to take a look at this to give you some exact dates on what happened in Asia. Sepoy was when the British then make India a crown colony and take away the authority of the East India Company. The Sepoys rebelled. They were soldiers that were forced to use lard, which to Hindus and Muslims is an unclean thing. Anything to do with pork is unclean, and they had to use that to grease their cartridges in the new rifles that they were going to have to be using from the 1850s on. And there was a serious rebellion that the British Army was forced to move in and put down. Back to Africa. Slavery had largely been eliminated in the Atlantic side by the 1870s, but it will continue on in places like the Congo, where they were used in mines and to do other labor in that wretched colony of the Belgian king, King Leopold. And this is from 1904, and there's still slavery going on there and in parts of East Africa, even though the slave trade there is going to be abolished at Zanzibar eventually. So as the slave trade declined, the Europeans became more interested in so-called legitimate trade. Peanuts grow very well on the African continent. There are vast forests in sub-Saharan Africa. The hides of all the great beasts like elephants and lions and tigers will be used. Palm oil is extracted from West Africa, and there is a huge demand for that during the beginning of the 19th century. And again, we've been talking about this continent now is a source of new markets for the finished textile goods and other manufactured products of the Europeans. And the scramble begins in the mid-1880s when several European states, including Belgium, France, Germany, and Britain, engaged in a feeding frenzy to seize a piece of the African cake before the plate had been picked clean. By 1900, virtually all of the continent had been placed under some form of European rule. The British consolidated their authority over the Nile Valley and seized additional territories in East Africa. More on that in a moment. The French advanced eastward from Senegal into Central Sahara, and they also occupied Madagascar and other territories in West and Central Africa. We will look at a map at the very end of this video. The Germans claimed the hinterland opposite Zanzibar, where the East African slave trade was conducted very late into the 19th century, as well as coastal strips in West and Southwest Africa. And King Leopold will claim the Congo for his own personal use, and he will use it. Italy entered the contest in the early 20th century and took the territories of what is today Libya. And here we come to the other reason for why the Europeans divide up the continent of Africa. They're competing against themselves. They're afraid that if they don't take over some of these states, one of their rival European states will. And as one British diplomat remarked, a protectorate at the mouth of the Niger River would be an unwelcome burden, but a French protectorate there would be fatal. Hence, as in Southeast Asia, as Thailand was kept as a buffer between the British and the French, the statesmen felt compelled to obtain colonies as a hedge against future actions by their rivals. And in East Africa, Germany annexed the colony of Tanganyika. So, to prevent violence from coming out between the great powers, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened a conference in Berlin in 1884 to set the ground rules for future annexations of African territory. And like the famous open door notes that we're going to talk about in the next chapter for China, issued by American Secretary of State John Hay, the conference combined high-minded resolutions with hard-headed recognition of practical interests. The delegates called for free commerce in the Congo and along the Niger River, as well as for further efforts to end the slave trade. At the same time, the participants recognized the inevitability of the imperialist dynamic, and they agreed only that future annexations of African territory should not be recognized until effective occupation had been demonstrated. So again, might makes right. And there are no African delegates at this conference. So all of these borders, all of these territories are established without any consideration of historic African tribal boundaries. A problem to this day. In the north, the British will solidify their control over the entire Nile Valley to protect the Suez Canal from the French. Egypt was controlled before the British take it over completely by Muhammad Ali. He will be the Pasha, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, which is crumbling. And because the Suez is the gateway to the crown jewel of the British Empire, India, going this direction greatly saves time instead of having to go all the way around the bottom of Africa in Cape Town. You go through the canal into the Red Sea and on into the Indian Ocean. And they are going to protect this, and they took the Sinai as a result before the British did, because the Ottomans are not really enforcing anything by the 19th century. In South Africa, the Boers, or the Afrikaans, will be Dutch settlers that come there in the 1830s and 40s. They're mainly farmers, and they are bitterly opposed by the Zulus, a Bantu-speaking people who resisted European encroachments on their territory for decades. And this lithograph depicts the Zulu warriors engaged in battle with their European rivals. And their resistance is not quelled until the end of the 19th century with the introduction of the machine gun. Shaka Zulu was a very famous Zulu warrior and leader. The migrations of the Boers went into historic native tribal areas, and that's why the conflicts broke out. And also, the British have a presence in the Cape Colony. Cecil Rhodes, as we'll see in a moment, became the chief administrator there. And they're English speaking, and the Boers are Dutch speaking, the Afrikaners are Dutch speaking, and they're trying to get away from the English, and they're going to become antagonists. And the British move into South Africa because they want to establish a rail system from Cape Town to Cairo, Egypt. And they're going to end up ruling this directly. There are problems because they had discovered gold and diamonds in the Boer Republic of the Transvaal, and they want to control that extraction. And after Cecil Rhodes, the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, attempted to bring the Transvaal under British rule, the Boer War broke out between Britain and the Boer Republics in 1899. And guerrilla resistance by the Boers was fierce, but the vastly superior forces of the British were able to prevail by 1902. And to compensate the Afrikaners for the loss of independence, they agreed that only whites would vote in the now essentially self-governing colony. And in 1910, the Union of South Africa will become independent, the first independent country in Africa. But there was a lot of hardships because of the brutalities committed, and the British actually introduced an institution later known as the concentration camp, and that left great bitterness on both sides. And here you have Africa in 1914. The blue is French, the green is Italian. Eritrea is independent again today, actually, ladies and gentlemen. It would become part of Ethiopia after World War II, but it's now independent again. And the Italians will end up taking over. They will defeat the Abyssinians in the 1930s with mechanized warfare. Spears and shields didn't work too well against tanks. The Germans are purple. That prevented the British from building that rail all the way down. German Southwest Africa. Angola is Portuguese. The Congo, as we mentioned, was controlled by Belgium. And these areas are the only independent states. And Ethiopia after 1935 will no longer be independent either. Just Liberia will remain. And so ends chapter 21 on the age of imperialism.